if it's in Norwegian, they have also this AE that's working together.
This is not reasonable. This is not reasonable nowadays. Okay, so sheets, this. I have to display.
But I leave it to you to
Yeah, to look at the
present and tell people if they should finish or things like that. I will just run this. I love this one. People have come online.
Oh, they should be here.
Yeah.
We're starting. Nobody's here yet.
Yeah. We have less people in the room than presenters. That's a bad sign.
Yeah. I saw Farmy, so she should be coming.
Wow, it's cold in here.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's super cold here.
So do you need anything?
No, I think we're fine.
You're fine? Okay.
You go back to the heat.
Sit down somewhere.
Somehow.
Yeah.
Pretty much, yeah. This is one of the few times it actually has worked out.
Farmy told she would come, right? Farmy? I saw Farmy. I saw Farmy at the.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think she will come. No?
Yeah, of course. I think she will. I don't know. This we'll see.
Another thing I filed an issue for on the disability draft. His argument was that the NAP people will be something that's much shorter. Because this is going to be maybe 3 pages.
But I mean, this is just like,
Well, it's informational,
it's
but
like, don't do it.
it says do nothing, yes.
I think they don't do any or
Well, there's that. That was his recommendation, so I'm going to go with it.
I saw
It's
that
easier. We can merge
this
them
room
in.
will be available after the session, so we can just grab some food and continue discussing here.
Sure.
So we like the plan I originally so SAT somehow like the handshake we put on the
Just write the bullet and write the book up quick.
No, it should be shorter than mine.
You could sell dozens of copies.
I have this good paper which has line very on one paper.
So who's starting yours, starting
And he would
language.
and he like looked at me very late and I did the last minute just to correct everything that was wrong. And he let me put his name on it. So I agreed to put my name on the paper because he did quite a bit.
yeah.
That's very well said. Like both people like this paper on paper.
It was about IETF, but
It was like,
Or both.
it was like very early stage of IETF.
Maybe
so
we-
it's like more
When do they start the session recording?
yeah, I mean,
Because
I
there
guess
is a
RFCs
camera.
is scary when they're like curved.
Yeah, it's on all the time. So
Oh, okay, so people see me.
So we should start
Well, ask your.
the meeting.
Also, I mean, there's different audiences.
Is this
You really
on?
almost need a separate thing for application over proper rater.
Yeah, but then also if you want
So, hello. Welcome to this Alto session. So the working group chairs are not here to chair the session. So Berrier and myself will do this on behalf of the chairs. So we already identified note takers for this session, which will be Richard and Kai. Thank you, Richard and Kai.
Should be that.
Ah.
Well,
So yeah, this is
yeah, you can use that one.
okay. So please take a look at the note well slides. Okay. So as for the status of the working group, the focus is currently on finishing the charter items and the working group items. So the agenda has been set up accordingly with a priority on working group items. So the goal is to finish this milestone as soon as possible. The problem is that the authors lacks in finalizing their documents, for example, the SSE draft. So as a solution, the chairs will divide the remaining drafts between them and follow up with authors and editors to close them out by the next IETF in Vancouver. So the agenda is as follows, reflecting the priorities. We will have four presentation relating to working group items. So performance metrics, unified properties, path vector, footprint and capabilities. And we will also have two presentations on personal exploration work for future Alto use cases done by Luis to determine service edge and to extend Alto by using BGP communities. So as for the working group progress since the last meeting in Montreal, so we have two working group items that are well progressing. And the SSE draft is basically done. The second working group last call is over. And all other working group items are very close to being finalized. So in more detail, so the cross-domain server discovery is now in the RFC editor queue. The cost calendar is in IESG processing. As for the SSC, there was an old working group last call that has expired. So another one has been issued like a week ago, and it will expire on December 8th. And so we look right now for 2 volunteers to read the draft. I believe we had already identified some during the last meeting. So please send us a notice, or if you are in the room and volunteer to review it, please let us know. The CDNI FCI with Alto, so a new version has been published. It's ready, but really needs feedback from the CDNI working group. So a message was sent out to the CDNI working group to review the document in that perspective with a tentative deadline for December 15th, and Jensen will present it today. Performance metric, a new version was published, and Richard will present it today as well, and we'll see if it's ready for working group last call. Unified property and path vector, they progress as a bundle. So new versions have been published as well. Kai will present path vector and will present unified properties, and we'll see how far it is from working group last call. And last but not least, we had yesterday morning a side meeting on application and network integration, who was organized in 2 sessions, first session with presentation and the other one with discussion. So the purpose was to study how application and network can integrate to perform gap analysis, what is missing on either side, and how this can help defining some work for Alto, but also beyond Alto. So the agenda was as follows. So we had 4 presentations, one by Tencent on network-aware 5G cloud interactive service, another one by Telefonica on integration of Telefonica CDN with the transport network, another one by Huawei, which was about application-aware networking, whereas Alto is more on network-aware applications. And finally, we had a presentation by Richard on application and network integration, possibility, challenges, and the next steps. So the slides and the minutes have been posted on the mailing list, and we hope a second side meeting will happen during the Vancouver IETF. So last, is there any other business that you would like to discuss during this session? So yes, remember the intent is to wrap up all existing work items by Vancouver, meaning by Vancouver working group last call is over. So at least. So I'll hand now to the first presentation, which is Richard, and yeah, and Richard, you have 15 minutes.
I may not need all of 15 minutes, but we'll see. Hey. Oh, okay. Okay, so right. Yeah, can you make it full screen?
On my way.
Okay, thank you. So, okay. So I'll talk about the updates on the auto performance metrics document. And this is one document which we got a lot of feedback, and which I think we are wrapping up. I think we made pretty good progress. And hopefully by this time, and we'll get the feedback from the working group, and then we can really wrap up. So, and that's, I think we're missing the top. So basically, and here is the issue I want to talk about, and essentially the presentation would consist of, you know how to fix it?
Yeah.
It's fine.
Oh. Oh. Great, thank you so much. So basically, I'll first talk about updates and what we did from version 6, 7, essentially from 7 to 8. And I'll talk about the single remaining issue, which I think we know how to resolve, but we do want to talk to the working group. And then I'll talk about plan for next step, okay? And so let me first talk about the changes that we made from version 7 to version 8, essentially between these two IETFs. And to record, really for people to record what exactly why we're making the changes is, remember this very interesting conversation during IETF last time. And essentially is that time the major decision point was, do we want to have defined the performance metrics to be consistent or be based on the existing metrics based on input IPPN? So we have feedback and people from IPPN, they came in and gave a very increased opinions and so on. And just to refresh people's memory a little bit, and on your left-hand side is the auto performance metrics, for example, latency, RTT, and so on. So essentially, we have all the metrics over there about auto metrics. And on the right-hand side would be all the metrics defined by IPPN. So therefore, it's quite a detailed, for example, our round-trip delay, active IP UDP, and periodic, depending which RFC in which section, and so on. There was quite an intensive discussion about this topic. And I think eventually it was made quite clear, of course, both during the session and right after the session. And the decision was, the feedback was, clarify that auto really metrics are really guidance. They're really not exactly what the performance metrics really we did and so on. So eventually should really be focusing on that. We're really essentially providing only guidance only. So therefore, that will solve a lot of these major issues. So what do we do? And essentially what we did is very simple. And what we did was to really clarify that really the auto metrics will be just guidance. But then, of course, that's really even less high-level principle, which we took very seriously. But now the issue is there can be multiple types of guidance, even for the same metric. For example, the metric could be delay. And now, for example, here, for people who can read, maybe type 2 small fonts, and they're from Sprint and AT&T, for example, the guidance could be service level agreement. For example, over here, you can see they have a target value. Oftentimes, it's a service level offering or service level agreement. And it can also be some kind of measurements or estimation, for example, monthly estimation and so on. Oftentimes, you don't update very frequently. Update, for example, at much higher granularity than the IPPM would do. But we still have multiple types, for example, service level agreement and versus estimation. So how do we solve this issue over there? So eventually, the decision turns out to be very simple. And the way to really solve is to allow multiple types of guidance, and you specify what type of guidance you are really providing. You're not really specifying all like details IPPM, but you specify that you're providing a guidance on what type of guidance it is. For example, for people who can read the tiny fonts, to allow, essentially here's a new text, and that was the version 7, and this is version 8. And to allow to avoid fine grain information, and document introduce cost source to indicate the high-level types of guidance which Alto would provide. So that's essentially the solution. So therefore, we usually introduce this field and call the cost source, and then you have estimation, SLA. That's the way to solve this problem. So therefore, really make it clean. It's guidance. It's not all the details and so on. And then after this one, now turns out left to be a little bit easy. And the next step we need to do is we need to really define the details. Remember, IETF defined base, bytes, optional, and all these requirements. And so therefore, what we said was, and for the cost type, which is a data type system in Alto, and we introduced an optional extension field called cost source over there. So basically, the document defined this one as a source, and essentially here is defined. This one is defined as optional field over there. And then what happens is a core source should be registered to allow extension. So that's the second requirement. That's the essential second index. Introduce an optional field and make this one to be with like IANA registration. And right now we do have 2 registrations, and one is estimation and one is SLA. So therefore now we can really solve the problem. With this one, and now it turns out life to be easy. So therefore, next change we made was also pretty simple, straightforward now. And because we have all the examples, and so therefore now what really they are they IPPM or what they are? Of course, now they're guidance. And of course, for here, I guess I think really make it clear is, and we basically said will be essentially we have the cost source, but we make estimation as a default value. For example, we did not even modify all the examples. We just say, okay, for all the examples, and because there's no optional cost source extension field, and therefore the cost source really is just extension. So therefore, we just add comments to every single example. We said we could remember cost type does not include the cost source field. So therefore, the value which essentially should be interpreted as the estimation to solve this issue. Okay. And given this one, now really given that we no longer dependent on IPPM, we also made a second change, which I think I should also clarify, is we no longer will always, for example, the representation of based on IPPM, and now we introduce much simpler representation of all the cost values. For example, here, and we just say, for example, here is a delay. We say the metric type value is a single JSON number, and conforming to the number specification of RFC 8259 and section 6, and non-negative, therefore become much simpler. We no longer really need to really tie up with IPPM, which means we can move on independently, and same for other metrics defined on document. So that's what we did. Okay. The only potential complexity introduced by introducing the cost source optional field is backward compatibility. So, and here is the issue which we described in the document. Potential issue introduced by the optional cost source field is backward compatibility. Consider an ID and its information resource directory, and define 2 cost type and with the same cost mode and cost metric. But one with core source being estimation, the other one being SLA. But if you're really backward, it's like an old Alto client, and you wouldn't know which one it is. It's really estimation, or you really it's SLA because it's an optional field. We don't understand. The auto definition is you just skip and this particular optional field. Now, and that's potentially can be an issue. And now our solution turns out to be very simple to address this issue. The only defined metric in RFC 7285, which is the standard-based Alto protocol, the only metric defined one is called the routing cost. And we make it essentially said would be this one can only be estimation. So therefore, if you use a new cost metric, and for the new cost metric, and you must be able to make a difference between essentially estimation and SLA. Otherwise, your everything is just fine. So I think that's the only issue we try to solve. And now let me talk about the only remaining issue here. The only remaining issue here turns out to be very simple. Is this moment we have defined two cost source types, and one is SLA, one is estimation. And the only thing which I believe which was mentioned last time during the IETF 105 meeting was maybe we should really have third type, which is called a nominal type. For example, what's nominal type? For example, here use nominal type means, for example, for bandwidth is linear capacity. For example, that basically means that's really my linear capacity, and according to my link label is 10 gig, so therefore it's called a normal value or nominal value. And therefore, it's not estimation, or it's not really estimation. The current we think probably SLA is good enough, and estimation is good enough. We did not really define nominal, but there's some other discussion. Maybe we should really introduce nominal. Essentially, it's a very, very simple change. We added one, and most people essentially, for example, linear capacity, you probably that's the most relevant one would be essentially define essentially a fixed value, and that's the linear capacity. So that's the only remaining issue which we want to get people's opinions, if any. So therefore, the next step. And turns out to be pretty simple. And number one is for the feedback on the remaining item. And then we'll really talk to some people from IPPM. And then what we do is we're going to submit an update. And if for example, we should really revise, for example, add the nominal cost source type. And then we do everything by mid-December. And then we probably can go down the final version and people can give last comments. And then we wrap up this document. So that's pretty much what I have. And any comments, suggestions, and so on?
Qianwu from Huawei, one of our co-authors. Thank you, thank you, Richard, to take care of this work. Actually, one of comments for this is you mentioned one type you introduced is estimation. And I want to make sure it is default behavior, because in some of the example you actually make a comment. Actually, you think if doesn't include a cost source, that indicate it is estimation. Does it mean actually this estimation type is kind of default type?
It is. So
Okay.
by default, I think, for example, and yes. So auto server basically is an optional field if you don't indicate it, and the default value is yes, it is here. And so the application must assume that the value of cost source is estimation if you skip it.
Okay, thank you.
So therefore, we do have this default value. Yes, you're right.
Yeah.
Any comments and any other opinions? For example, should we do, for example, the nominal type, or maybe read SLA and estimation would be good enough? Opinions or no opinions? Hey, Jing.
So for nominal type, can I interpret it as actually kind of average or mean?
Is I think the way that's why the complex SLA typically means that's really my guarantee, right? That's typically you see all the websites they really announce SLA. I think for the example we talked to several people, they say typical that's really SLA special one because I tell you that's my SLA. And estimation I think from let me show over here probably that's a good example. For example, so typical this SLA you announce it. And this is even published. For of course, this information is a bit hard to use because essentially they are really like publishing the website. You need to pass all the websites. You don't want to update and so on. And estimation basically means, for example, this estimation. I think this AT&T estimation they update every 1 month or every once in a while. We don't want any updates, but that's their estimation. Essentially, they're running average. They continue to really like provide estimation. And nominal, what we want to say is essentially it's a value which, for example, traditional like a normal value, which is you should expect it to be 10 gig. But because that's really my normal value, but if it is really not right and something you should really take care of because we assume it's only guidance and there's no guarantee about that. But the SLA progress guarantee over there.
Okay, thank you for clarification.
Yeah.
Herr Kühlewind, So actually, the nominal value seems to be more useful than the estimate to me. But anyway,
It's not estimation because I leak 10 gig. And you may or may not run 10 gig by my nominal value 10 gig. That's why people said nominal makes a lot of sense for many contexts.
and I actually would take that one as the fault, to be honest.
Okay.
But
okay, go ahead.
okay, what my actual point was, like, we came, the discussion we had last time was because there was like some use case where people actually want to use this information on a very small time scale. And then like, it would be important to actually understand how it was measured and what the time scale is for the measurement and so on. And that has like a lot of problems. And like when I'm looking at this slide right now, I also doesn't seem to be in the intention here. So does the draft say anything about this, about timescales?
Typical SLA is not really estimated as essential. For example, typical SLA wouldn't give you the, okay, I think maybe your question could be like the two-part meaning. Let me clarify which one you meant.
For the estimation, I was...
estimation.
Yeah.
Okay. Can I first clarify SLA? Even SLA would potentially have the issue over there. For example, SLA basically typically means how long is SLA is valid for 1 month, 1 day, for 1 year, and so on. And
yes.
second one, SLA also means, for example, typically in SLA, you really have some kind of definition. And say, for example, it's SLA and it's really married in this way. Typically, that's how you read it, like a contract, right? So the way we want to do is the following: is we only say that's estimation, and remember, is in the cost type system we have the cost mode and the cost metric and the cost source. We also have description, and the suggestion this moment is in the cost description, which optional field, you give a link to describe where this full value is fully specified, and people can really retrieve it. But we don't want to go to details of, for example, actually define for measured every 5 milliseconds, every 10 milliseconds, and so on. We don't want to go down that path. We want to give it like a coarse-grained, high level to use essential guidance. That's the decision. Is that okay with you, or maybe that's?
This makes sense. But like, what's your expectation? What the time frame people will use here?
I think typically, number one, of course, is, for example, estimation. We probably expect people to update, for example, in order of days, months. That typically it's like people update our website, probably updates in like days, months. I think all these values oftentimes are typically like updates like a monthly average value, for example. And they are not really fine-grained round trip time updates, of course.
Okay.
And SLA, of course, much longer. Oftentimes they publish it, don't even touch for a long, long time.
So that means definitely per like whatever connection request or whatever, it should be stable, right?
It should be stable.
Yeah,
relative,
so I think that's a good recommendation to actually write down in the draft.
Sure. So we probably can essentially, in operational consideration part, we probably classify a little bit. Of course, that depends on the context, but we recommend probably there should be low relative stationary values. Thanks. Luis.
Hi, this is Luis from Telefonica. When you have mentioned the nominal value, you have referred to the bandwidth, which is clearly, let's say, an absolute value. But I was wondering if for other cases, that could be the delay, for instance, we could manage percentiles or I mean, not absolute values, but 95% of the time. This is so my question is if this also could be considered as nominal value or would be estimation. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think that's the complexity of introduce a nominal value, what exactly it is, and which one's normal, which one's abnormal, and you're right. So 95% upfront, I don't know how to specify it, and because I would introduce the complexity of basically the complexity we did not want to really get into is all these IPPM complexities and which percentile and how to do measure at what interval. That's so complex. Most applications don't need this type of information at all. But the short answer is I'll think about that. Maybe I'll just give some comments and eventually probably this moment, I think for me, if we can give estimation and we can give, for example, some for bandwidth, we can give nominal value. Other ones, if you don't know how to define this moment, we're probably okay with essentially only bandwidth for nominal value is valid. And for delay, we probably can defer to a future document, which can try to extend more fine-grained diverse, like richer metrics, but for later document.
Okay, thank you.
Would that be okay? Okay, great.
Any more questions? So,
Wonderful.
sorry?
I don't think we have time.
No, yeah, okay. So we'll switch to the next presentation will be done is on unified properties, will be done by myself. So this draft has been around for a while, and so the current update is not about the design. I'm sorry. I try to. Does it work? No. Okay. So at the last IETF, the conclusion about this draft was that it was very complicated and the introduction of the features of unified property were so complex and hard to understand. And so this is actually not the case as long as it is clearly explained and introduced. So the major changes in the present version are on simplification and clarification on how to introduce the new concept. So the major changes are on section 1, 2, 3. And of course, we started looking at some typos, but that was not the hardest part. So in the meantime, the draft grew even fatter, but we are now working hard to make it simple and concise. So there is no change in the design, as I said, but there is a very strong need to simplify the text. So we opted for a didactic approach and progressively introduce concept with progressive complexity. And of course, we did need to do that for the rest of the document, and that requires substantial revisions. So as a digest, the introduction has been made non-technical. We removed every text, any text that was like specifying already things. We added, the second section is now about the basic features of the United Property extension as they were defined in the first version of the document. And the third section is about advanced features for unified property. So this section explains limitations in some cases of using the basic features. It also explains the risk of an ambiguous client requests and how to solve it. And this ambiguity issue was around for like more than a year and caused some head scratching. So we finally found a design that solves it. This is now the new talk for the 3 first sections. So in section 2, as you will see, we introduce basic features. What is an entity? Generalizes endpoints, examples. What is an entity domain? Defined as a set of entity of the same type, which is also defining the type of the entity domain. It also defines the entity ID format, and we give examples. Section 2.4, entity property that can be network aware, like an AS number, or network agnostic, like a geographical region. And 2.5, new information resource, because that's one of the key points of the draft. We introduce a new media type and a new resource, which is called Alto property map, that you can have via get mod or via post mod. Section 3 introduces advanced UP extension features. So we have section 3.1 that establish the relation between an entity identifier and an entity domain with some rules. And especially a rule saying that the entity is not, the entity points to a physical or logical object, but you can have 2 different entities that point to the same physical and logical object, because Alto is like, it's a map. So the object in an Alto map is a identifier. So you have one endpoint that has a IPv4 address and an IPv6 address. You have 2 entities, because several different applications use different address formats, and so you need those 2 entities. So 3.2 defines resource-specific entity domain name. Why do we need that? Because the PID, for example, the entity which an entity which is a PID domain has an identifier like I'm sorry. Okay, here. So you can use the same identifier in different network maps. So if you only use this identifier for a PID, you cannot distinguish in which information resource, in which property map it is defined. So this is why we compose the entity domain name with the resource where it has been defined. For example, here you want to define an entity domain PID. So, and if you want to distinguish between PID number 10 defined in two different network maps, you need to compose your entity domain with the resource ID. So here, if you use this and this, you can distinguish between the two entities, which otherwise you cannot. Section 3.3 does, well, similarly, the same, we have the similar issue for entity properties. Same, if a property is defined relatively to an information resource, the property value can change depending on this information resource. So if you query a property for an entity, for example, defined in the IPv4 entity domain, this endpoint can have two PID properties in two different network maps. Two different network maps use this endpoint and define a PID property. So if you want to query the value of the PID property for this IPv4 entity, you need to specify in which network map you want it. So the resource here is impacting the property value. So, and in the text, you can look up the text, and the text explains how to do this. No comments on section 3.4, sorry. 3.5 will be in the next slide. And 3.6 is this section 3.6 needs clarification. We are not done yet with the clarification. It's about IANA registration. And so there is a discussion regarding mapping definitions. Section 3.5. So this actually solves that ambiguity issue. We had the use case like more than 1 year ago on the FCI map capability use case. So in the initial design, there was one member on the capability. You had one member that was defining which entity domain types you can query, and the other member was listing what properties you can query on that on these entity domains. And the problems is that, well, actually you cannot query PID on every of those entities. PID does not exist on country code. It does not exist on ASN. How does the client figure out? So the solution is now to introduce a new member in the capability, and this member for each of the listed entity domain types gives you the list of property that you can query on this entity domain type, and it specifies it whether it's resource dependent or not. So here with this design, okay, you can end up with very long names, but this solves the problem in a clean way. So, and of course, we really need to simplify the text, but basically it appears to be pretty clearly defined now. So there is another work we started on illustrative sections. Some sections do not provide any protocol specification. They're meant to explain the design, but they introduce complexity and notions that are otherwise not useful to the implementers, given that RFC is meant for implementers. So we also want to clarify this. So the next steps will be to fix typos and errors that I detected right after sending the new version. Continue the clarification and cleanup, and this will be require substantial work. We also need to make a last check on the IANA section regarding how we define mappings and many things that have been added in this section. And once we are done, we will propose it for working group last call. So we really hope to be done. Well, I don't dare to promise a date, but hopefully in January or February latest. Any questions?
Richard Yan from here. So when you say you want to, I'm trying to understand, since I think you give a comment that this document is getting very long, right? I don't know, 50 pages or something like that.
50 pages.
Yes, it's getting very long. And one reason I think it got pretty long was it includes a lot of examples.
Yes.
And so when you say you want to clean up, do you mean to really clarify, remove examples, or I'm just want to get a little bit sense about what you really meant to really, for example, I think clarification, of course, makes all the sense. But when you say clean up, which direction potentially might be really pursuing?
Definitely, as far as examples are concerned, I rather tend to be willing to add examples. We need to add examples on abstracted network elements. We need to add examples on FCI capabilities, because they were the ones who caused, actually, who helped us identifying the ambiguity issue and led us to design this resource dependency. I'm more thinking about the text, where just the wording that can be really simplified. And so I think if there is no question, we can move to the next presentation, which is by Kai.
Thank you. Great. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Kai. I'm here to talk about the Alto path vector extension. So for those who are familiar and not familiar with the path vector extension, I'd like to give a quick summary of the current status of the draft. First, what is the motivation behind this draft? It wants to provide what kind of new features it provides. So in addition to the cost metrics before endpoints, and we also want to review some internal structures and detailed properties associated with these internal structures from the ISP's point of view for the path between a given set of source descending pairs. And examples that drives this draft includes bottleneck links for large-scale data analytics. And recently, we also received some inputs from other working groups that, for example, like 5G UPF functions, and also mobile edge computing, and probably service edges as well. They might benefit from this information we provided. And why this extension is essential to the Alto framework, there are two reasons. First, such information is useful. As we mentioned, we can derive resource correlations of flows, and also provide and also enable applications to identify contexts in the path they are afforded. And also, this information is not included in or supported in the current Alto framework. So how does this extension provide such information? To represent internal structures, we introduce a concept called abstract network elements, which will give more details about why we do this later. And then for the detailed property information, we reuse the unified property map for these abstract network elements. And to represent the path between basically the end-to-end communications, we reuse the Alto base protocol, basically the cost map and endpoint cost services, where it uses like source and destination pairs to represent potential communications between end hosts. And so what problems we need to solve in this draft? There are like two parts of the problem. First, we need to consider about some privacy concerns, and then we need to determine, basically this is related to how we determine the representation of our internal structures. And first, of course, we don't want to expose the physical properties of the network elements. So we want these elements to be abstract. And then there's a question of, are these internal structures persistent in the network, or they can be dynamic and constructed on demand? And our current decision that first we want to make these network elements abstract, and then because right now we are making them to be basically the scope of these the identifiers for these the elements are assumed temporary in a query, but we had a property to optionally expose persistent entities in the network. And we also, when we design this protocol, we also consider some performance issues that may arise when the developers are building their servers and clients. And one problem is scalability and also consistency as well, is the pattern of what, because essentially we are now requesting information of two resources in Alto. For the perspective, for the correlation, for the abstract network element part, we need the resource of cost map or endpoint cost service. But for the properties, we want to use the unified property map. So the problem is we are actually now requesting two resources. So do you want to request these two resources in a single query or in two separate queries? And not separate, two consecutive queries. And that brings us to a problem of one-round communication and two-round communication. And our current, and also there's implementation complexity. Basically, when you want to implement, you want to upgrade the Alto implementation to support the perspective extension, then there's the problem that you want to use a new message format, or you want to reuse the old format that is already supported in the Alto base protocol. And our decision is to use one-round communication with multi-part response, so that we can first, if we use two-round communication, then you have to keep track of the previous of the first request before you can provide the properties for the second request. And that means you need to cache the request. You need to cache the first request before you can return the result of the second request, and that could lead to scalability problem of the server. And also the problem with for the multi-part response, so that means we need to use one-round communication, and then we want to reuse the format that we already have for the Alto protocol. So we want to, so the decision is to make them into two different parts of a single message, and these two parts should be included in one multi-part response. And a quick summary of what we did in the last two IETF. So in IETF 105, basically we did some kind of a major revision, and first we finalized the specification for the cost type extension. For the extension of the cost type, we essentially introduced a new cost type. The cost mode is array, and the cost metric is ANE path. And we also clarify the property negotiation process, because so before 08, there's no explicit explanation of how the property negotiation is happening between client and a server. And we basically clarify, we add a new section to explicitly specify the negotiation process of the properties for ANE. And we also introduced a persistent entity as an initial registry entry for ANE properties. And we clarify the part resource ID in the multi-part message, because this is actually related to integration with incremental updates. And so in the last revision, it is synchronized with SEC draft version 16. And I recently checked the status of SEC, and I see there's a new version popping up. So this is actually a really remaining issue that we need to solve in the next revision. And we also so before 08, we leave the capability of cost counter of future work, and in the last revision, we actually propose solutions for the cost counter capability problem. And so after IETF 105, we basically, because before 105, we did a lot of work, and after 105, we had a minor revision. That's the latest version, and we emphasize that abstract network elements can be constructed dynamically to the query, and we highlight the benefits of this decision in multiple places in the draft. And here I'm going to talk about some remaining issues. First, as Sabine mentioned in the chair slides, there's a dependency between the pass vector draft and also the unified property draft. And first, I have identified 3 dependencies. First, the terminology dependency, and also the format of the property map basically reuses the response data format from the unified property draft. And also, we need to register some property domains and oh, sorry, there's a typo. It should be entity domain and entity properties should be registered using the mechanism defined in the unified property draft. And currently it is synchronized with the unified property version number 08. I think there's a newer version, right?
Number 10 now.
Yeah, okay. And also there's a dependency on the SEC drafts. And basically in SEC 17, it includes a section saying how we should handle multi-part message using SEC. So this part should be removed from the current pass vector extension now. And I also identified there's a terminology inconsistency between these 2 drafts. So it is called, so the same object is called part resource ID in pass vector, and is called content ID in SEC. And we need to resolve this issue in the next revision. And here's a revision plan. So first, in terms of writing, we need to fix the dependency issues and improve the quality of the writing. And we also, and to improve the quality of writing, we need some feedback from the working group as well. And another revision is, so based on the discussion with Sabine and also some inputs from other IETF working groups, so in our current design, the ANE is designed to be homogeneous. So we provide the same unified, the same properties for all the ANEs returned by the pass vector extension. But there is actually a growing demand in the internet that we might want information about heterogeneous ANEs. So first, for example, in the side meeting talks we had yesterday, so a Chinese company called Tencent, they are building a cloud gaming platform which might use this information from, they are collaborating with some ISPs to gather information from the network. And also, I listened to a talk called Compute First Networking. They are basically trying to do some load balancing for MEC servers. And I think there's so the ability to expose capabilities in the network to the for better end-to-end communication is actually a growing demand in the network today. And so according to the discussion with Sabine, and we both agree that, at least my understanding is that we both agree is that pass vector can be used as a mechanism to expose these capabilities to the application layer. And I think if we go down this path, it will strengthen the power of auto extensions and also extend the scope of Alto, because right now we are more focusing on some traditional networking scenarios such as flow scheduling and resource shared risk groups. And if we can extend a bit, it will allow us to bring to adapt to the growing trend today. And the reason why I think we can do it is that it actually doesn't require a lot of work for the passive vector draft. So what we need to do is first we need to define the entity type, the structure for these ANEs. Basically, we need the ability to we first need to identify what types of ANEs we need and what should be the properties associated with different types of ANEs. And in order to do that, the property negotiation process should be slightly tweaked in the current draft. But this is actually not a big deal because the capabilities are launched in. So right now, we are using a more simplified version because previously we only have one type of ANE, and right now the extension is actually we have multiple types, and that is actually a good news because because for different ANEs can be considered as different types of entities. That means we can reuse the capabilities from the unified property map. So actually, I think this is actually a good news for us, because that basically means the unified property draft and the passive vector drafts, they have more. We don't have to build a new mechanism to expose the properties for different entities. And after we adopt this change, what follows that we might need to identify more ANE drafts. Maybe work with other working groups, for example, working groups that are related to the mobile edge or like 5G, and then we need to register the related entity type and their properties to the unified property map. But that the part including what follows is not part of the passive vector extension. It should be maybe considered as a new individual extensions to the unified property draft. And the conclusion that the current status of the draft, the motivations and potential problems, I think we have already made them relatively clear, and most part of the specifications are relatively complete and stable, except the part that I mentioned about the heterogeneous abstract network elements. And I like to say thanks to the co-authors and also the working group for the feedback and guidance. And for the next step, first I think we need to make a revision to adopt the changes that we mentioned earlier, and we want to set a milestone for working group LESCO. So yeah, I was actually more conservative, and I think maybe we can do this in IETF 108, but I think the working group chair would like to push us to finish it in the next, basically in Vancouver. And also we like to call for reviews. Yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Great. So can I ask two questions on one simple and one simple, one might be more complex? And the simple version is the following. And so for the performance metrics, we have introduced the newer cost source field, SLA and estimation. And very likely, of course, right now there's no dependency, but actually I think passive vector most likely will use cost metric of bandwidth, available bandwidth. That's probably one of the most typical use cases. What's available bandwidth for the code flows, right? Because I think that's one of the major use cases which are being pushed for in so many places. And so very likely that particular metric, available bandwidth, will be defined in the performance metric document, which means now you actually really could have a dependency. One is you define a metric yourself, and one is you use a metric defined in the cost performance metric document. And then you're going to have to create a dependency. Very likely, my understanding will be the performance metric document probably go first, will probably become standardized. So what do you envision how to solve this dependency issue? So even for that one, I mean, let me be very specific. Number one is, do you think, for example, available bandwidth would be SLA, or would it be estimation, or you need like a nominal or some different types of a cost source?
I think for example, in the example we have in the passive vector draft, we probably are using some either SLA or nominal, basically with some guarantees from the ISP. But I don't think that part, basically either it's SLA or estimation or nominal, should be included as part of the pass vector draft, because pass vector draft does not specify what specific ANEs or properties that should be using. I think they probably need another draft to basically these should be registered to the unified property registry. They should be registered using the mechanism defined in the unified property draft.
Yeah, but this one really comes from the cost metric, from cost type system, right? And so therefore, that's probably not handled by the unified property. Most likely be coupling with the performance metrics. So of course, I mean, we'll probably go take this on. We can take this offline, but the high level thing really potentially, maybe there's some feedback which can give to the performance metrics documents. Oh, that's really a new type of guidance. And so what exactly really it is. I think that's when you should suddenly realize maybe there's such a dependency. I think that's one. And number two is, very quick comment, if I may actually use 1 or 2 minutes, would be the dependency on, if you really want to do extension of to handle heterogeneous, can you go to heterogeneous ANE part? That actually, number one, of course, it's super cool, right? Because even now, probably even right now today, and in Denver and Colorado, I think there's these people, Caltech and ESNet, all the people doing demos. I think one of the demos was using this like ANE stuff, pass vector. They're doing all the demos with all the major use cases, with all the big scientists, big data analytics. And so therefore, it's actually, I think that's pass vector one of the most useful thing. But then if you do this extension, and that probably, like you mentioned, you potentially can add complexity. So do you really envision the final version would include all these heterogeneous, or not really a single, simple, most base class of ANE?
I think we probably need, first we need to define, when we design the protocol, we definitely should leave some space for future extensions. But I don't think we should, for example, consider every single types of ANEs and put them in this draft. In this draft, we probably just define a very basic, basically an initial registry to the as the ANE. Basically, we probably need to consider ANE as a family of entities, not a specific type of entities. And then we probably want to introduce the very basic ANE with some, for example, like bandwidth properties and some simple properties before we go in. And if we can, for example, maybe later when we want to consider more complicated use cases such as like MEC and UPF, then maybe we need to add, put them in another individual draft. And for example, we want to saying that we want to define a new type of ANE called UPF ANE, and what could be the properties associated with that. I think that's the way I think this draft should go.
Just a very, very quick comment as a co-author, and as because I'm very motivated by this heterogeneous stuff. The metrics that are conveyed by the Alto performance metrics are metrics on path. And properties here are properties on network elements. So to me, the bandwidth in performance metric is not the same as the bandwidth is some data center or element. And the other quick comment is, what makes, in my view, this draft interesting is that it has a design that opens the way to any type of abstracted network element. So if it's only a switch, then we should name this extension extension switching, listing switches. So, but we need to.
Just you mentioned that you were looking for reviewers. Do you want them to review the current draft or the updated that you will make?
Yeah, I think maybe after the IETF we would submit a new version, and then we can post it to the working group. And maybe I think it's probably better to review the latest one.
Okay. Are there anybody in the room that would be willing to review that draft when it comes on the mailing list? Okay, then you have to find them on them.
Hi, this is Luis.
Yeah.
I volunteer to review.
Okay, excellent, thanks.
Yes.
yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
So Richard.
Thank you so much. Okay, mine. So I'll be quick, and like I mentioned, and then I did ask some questions, so therefore I could be very quick. So I'm going to give an update on the CDNI FCI document, and this one actually pretty stable now, and it's a good collaboration between Yang and Kevin and John, and also Jensen. So let me go over. I don't need 10 minutes. I probably can get it done in like 5 minutes. So the changes actually mostly just text edits. I think that's why it's a sign that's really most ready. And text edit in particular, actually mostly of the edits in the two versions will be consistent use of terminology and very thorough check for internal use. And also, I think one issue why we encounter all the text edits all the time in lately is because all the dependency among all the documents. So therefore, we need ability to be consistent with the dependency. For example, unified property document, we want to use the same terms. That's why we cause all these like text edits. Okay. And so number one, the change we made was very simple, is consistent use of terminology within the same document. We sometimes call it CDNI FCI service. Sometimes we call it CDNI FCI map service. And eventually we build the terminology and we make sure they all essentially use the same one. So that's the change number one we made. And then we also made the consistency to be consistent with the documents, the terminology used in other documents, for example, property map, and we also do the same thing. So basically, I don't need to go to all the details. That's essentially consistency. And we also need to be consistency with essentially the unified property document. And for example, there they were using the name change from entity address to entity identifier. We also start to really go through the whole document to make sure we use the same thing. I don't think we really depend on that document, but I think that's essentially what we did to do the updates. And for example, here is previously we called Alto Entity Domain Registry, and now right now really called Alto Entity Domain Type Registry. All these term changes because instead of chasing the dependency, that's why it makes life a little bit hard. But I think so far we're doing a pretty good job, and we make sure they're all consistent so we can move on as soon as possible. So to summarize, and I think the document is quite stable now, except really other people change their names, and we have to follow names. I don't know if there are any other clever way to do it. And we're essentially waiting for some comments from CDNI working group and from all authors over there give us the final comments, and until they sign off with all the changes. And then we essentially want to go to a working group last call, and we can wrap up this document. That's pretty much it. So I know it's short, but because we really don't need to change it too much. Okay, I'm done.
Okay,
Great.
perfect.
Then we would have
Any questions, comments? No? Okay.
So then we would have the same question as with the other draft. So are there potentially any people willing to review this document? Of course, we can ask afterwards, but yeah.
Mostly, I think probably people review a lot. Most people want to get a review from CDNI working group. That's probably most relevant.
Okay.
Okay.
So the last two presentations are not about working group items, but they address exploration work regarding modern networks.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, next presentation is about the idea of using Alto to determine the service edge. So somehow thinking on the evolution of the networks, and I referred to that in the previous talk. Potentially we will evolve by deploying new computing capabilities and so on. So the idea would be to leverage on the Alto capabilities in order to help us to identify the better edge for a given service. And here the point is to differentiate between the physical edge and the service edge. So not all the services necessarily have to go close to the access, so probably the edge for each service would depend on the kind of service to be on or to be delivered. So yeah, basically the situation is that now operators are starting to deploy distributing computing capabilities across the network. The edge environments, the more centralized data centers, large data centers close to the interconnection, etc., etc. These data centers, all of them, have different capabilities in terms of the environment itself, the size of the number of CPUs, memory, bandwidth, even for delivering the traffic and so. So the objective would be to think of mechanisms for assisting the decision in which data center we deploy a given service according to the restriction of these services in terms of latency, bandwidth, etc., etc. And we consider that Alto could play a role on this. So basically, the idea would be to incorporate into Alto all the information related to the computing environments, so CPUs, the memory, the storage, and so, and combine that with the topological information from the network in such a way that the Alto client could request the Alto server information based on the needs for the computing capabilities, but linking these recommendations, let's say from Alto, together with information from the network. So how the computing needs are commonly expressed. So typically they are structured in bundles of CPU, RAM, and storage units. And we can see this in commercial examples like Amazon Web Services or Microsoft Azure. There is another example that is being promoted, let's say, between Linux Foundation and DSMA, which is the Common Network Function Virtualization Infrastructure Telecom Task Force, CNTT. And in this particular case that we have taken as an example for the draft, the different flavors or instances are characterized by 5 different items, let's say. The type of instance, so basically this instance can be characterized as basic, network intensive, or computing intensive. The interface option, where basically declares the bandwidth of the interface that is required for the function to be deployed on top of that. The compute flavor, which basically refers to a combination between CPU, RAM, and disk, and the bandwidth for the management interface of this instance. Optional storage extensions to request additional storage capacity, and optional hardware acceleration characteristics in order that, in case that there is a specific need for the application running on top of these computing capabilities regarding the certain characteristics of acceleration in the delivery of the traffic. Here you can see more or less the kind of flavors that are being proposed in this CNTT initiative, and also you have here the link for checking that. And we have performed in this draft an initial mapping to the property maps in Alto. So this will be an initial exercise that we would like to develop and to complete in future revisions of the document. But basically it will be to take this as an example for exercising how Alto could play a role in this part. Regarding the association of computing capabilities and network topology, we have identified so far 3 potential solutions. This does not mean that could be others, for sure, but at least these ones are the potential solutions that we have identified. One could be to leverage and possible extend the service function aware topology model that is being moved into this working group. In fact, now in this service function aware topology model, we already include in the current version some information about the data center capabilities. Probably the idea that we are considering the authors of this draft is to move this forward and creating a specific document for that. So no mixing with the service function stuff itself, because the service function refers to the function and somehow separating the infrastructure from function, let's say. A second option could be to extend the BGPLS or to propose to extend the BGPLS RFC, including, among other attributes, the information of the compute part. And a third option could be to combine somehow the information from this infrastructure profiles catalog with the topological information by leveraging on the IP prefixes allocated to the gateway of the data centers. So basically populating this together with the IP of the gateway. So regarding next steps, we are considering to elaborate more on the mapping exercise to the property maps in Alto. So elaborating more in that example that I showed you before. To explore alternatives for the association of compute capabilities to network topology, and this probably the first step will be to generate this this document derived from the service function aware topology module. Also here, for sure, the idea is to collect interest from Alto working group to understand if this is something of interest for the working group, and if so, to document advances for next IETF in Vancouver. So that's all for this presentation. So you have comments?
Qingwu from Huawei. For the second point, actually, you mentioned you want to support a compute capability. So have you considered need to support a storage capability, or you think it's not a use cases? You only focus on compute capability?
Well, I refer compute in a general term, so it will be everything. It will be a number of CPUs, memory, storage, and so on. So complete information at the end. Probably structured in the somehow trying to abstract with this idea of bundles of flavors. This makes this more easy to handle than the individual values of memory and storage. But this is something to explore. But regarding your question, the idea would be to address everything, not only CPUs, but memory, storage, and so on. So I refer as compute in a general way, all the capabilities of a data center for deploying services.
For this compute capability, there's some relevant worker in SANFA. I'm not sure how to marry together for.
Well, in fact, this initiative, this one, try to standardize the way in which NFBI capabilities can be requested. So normalize somehow the way, well, not only requested, normalize the way in which the NFBI capabilities can be somehow exposed in such a way that the different network functions can be deployed in a similar way in different environments. So somehow we have this link with the NFBI stuff. That's the NFBI stuff.
Okay. I just remember some open issue in service-aware topology model. There's some open issues that relate to the NFA. Actually, I haven't followed discussion very closely. That seems actually that need to talk with SANFA to address that open issue. So probably you need to consider this.
Okay, thank you.
So Richard Young from Yale. So I think this is super interesting, and I do want to see. Do you envision this will be the inter-domain setting and eventually be a single network, or eventually this model will involve multiple domains, meaning multiple autonomous systems, and their computational or stored resources will be aggregated, or maybe they eventually only envision essentially a single one. You don't worry about eventually information aggregation issues.
The initial approach is single domain, so that could be applicable, I guess, I presume, to multiple domain case. Okay. Should not be probably too much complex. There will be probably issues of authentication, privacy, probably different levels of abstraction maybe. I think that it can be extended to multi-domain, but the initial approach is single domain, probably to start for the easy part and maybe to complicate the things.
Sure. Yeah, because if I may, so one reason why I want to raise this issue is the following. Several years ago, and IBM guys were trying to use this actually a map to really do their IBM private clouds to do the information aggregation. And of course, the setting was inter-domain, multi-domain setting. And turns out information aggregation turns out to be very, very tricky. So I can give you a very quick example, just like for the record. And for example, Alto cost information seems to be very easy. For example, essentially it's distance vector. If, for example, my cost to you is 5, your cost to Sabine is 3, and eventually if you do the relay from Sabine, from me to you to Sabine will be 5 plus 3 equal to 8. It's very easy to do the addition. Everything seems to be working. So I fetch my cost from me to you. You fetch your cost from you to Sabine. We add together, we got 8, everything seems to be okay. But somehow computation has this very weird property of somehow the algebra system somehow seems to be broken. And for example, the example which the IBM guys encountered was a very simple use case was, for example, I will say I have 2 units of CPU. I got information, I tell you, and you heard from Kai that he has 2 units of CPU. He also tells you, and you might tell Sabine that you have 4 units of CPU. But actually, funny thing might be, my 2 units of CPU might have heard from Mia, for example, 2 units, and Mia would also give, for example, the Kai 2 units. we all both tell you we have 2 units, and you got 2 units, and eventually you got 4 units, and you tell actually, for example, eventually something like you have 4 units. Actually, you don't. You only have 2 units. Somehow this information when they propagate, they somehow mingle. They cannot be distinguished. Somehow the information becomes quite complex. That's why eventually we encounter this issue. Actually, not us. Most actually IBM guys. Eventually, I don't know what eventually how they do it. I think they need to solve this issue for their cloud aggregation, heterogeneous cloud. They were using this Alto thing, using it as an example, but that's a completely encounter.
Okay, so thanks for the comment. Something to consider, yes.
Hi, Farney Borton from Sprint. So thank you for the presentation. I think it's very interesting, and I support further work in this area. In addition to the properties of the data center, I'm wondering if we should also consider the backhaul or the transport going into the property for that going into the data center, right? So it's something to think about. Also, I'd like to maybe work with you talk to you offline about possibility of maybe leveraging this idea with Etsy ZSM that I'm working in.
Okay, for sure. So regarding the backhaul and so, for sure, we intend to, let's say, mix all or playing with Alto help us or allow us to mix both worlds, let's say, the network part together with the compute part in a generic way, in such a way that we can take the best decision, but looking at both things together at the same time. So my answer will be yes. Okay. And for the second is at CCSM, for sure, we will talk about that.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Next one.
Yes, let's go for the next one. Okay, so here the idea is to, the objective is to present an idea, but that would be to extend Alto by using BGP communities. So the BGP communities BGP communities are a BGP attribute. Basically, is commonly used for grouping destinations. So you associate a number of prefixes to a community, and you define this community, and you basically use the communities for policy purposes for influencing the delivery of the traffic to certain prefixes. So this is basically the fact. These communities are represented as an integer number, with 32-bit length, basically including the information of the autonomous system. Also interesting, these communities, this community attribute can be carried across autonomous systems. So somehow could help us to support these multi-domain cases in the future as well. So the problem when looking at this issue was that basically we operators use extensively the BGP communities. It's a way of putting together some prefixes, some IP destinations. This is basically used for applying policies for the traffic, again, as I mentioned before, for influencing the behavior of the traffic toward different associated destinations towards the prefixes. The Alto protocol is based on IP prefixes, and the point here would be that we usually use these communities in aggregation nodes. So basically, when we allocate IP prefixes to a BNG or to a P gateway, somehow we are identifying the users behind of these IP prefixes with just a single identifier. So the point here would be, instead of going to individual IP prefixes, to play with the BGP communities in order to obtain the information, to retrieve the information from the Alto server. We see two benefits on this. One would be probably the reduction in the number of queries to the Alto server. So with just working with BGP communities, we could address information for different number of prefixes. And also to smoothly absorb the natural change in prefixes, because, well, with all the migration of users, and we need to move prefixes here and there, and sometimes this complicates, let's say, the management of the addressing, IP addressing in the internal of the network. So going with BGP communities, somehow we are hiding this complexity, and we will keep the Alto stuff more or less constant without so many changes. So regarding the next steps for this idea would be to elaborate more on the proposal. This is just to present you what we have in mind, to collect interest from Alto Group, to understand if this is of interest or not, actually, and also to document the proposal for the next IT meeting and create a specific draft for it. And that's all for this presentation.
So I only want to give one go. I think this is super clever. So for example, the essential the PID essential some kind of like, for example, a BGP attribute in some way doing aggregation, doing the marking, and this one is much more generic. I think it's a very clever proposal.
Thank you. And when referring to the multi-domain case that we have mentioned before, this because this is transitive, so we also could use this for the multi-domain case in order to support the multi-domain, basically.
So where do we have the blue sheets? Are they around somewhere? Okay, we'll find them. But if anybody, there they are. Anybody who didn't sign it, please do so. Any final questions on this?
So thanks everybody. We still have 5 minutes for open discussion if somebody would like to raise a question. Thanks a lot to Luis because this is, well, of course we are swamped with working group documents, but it's really important to have some lookout, and especially your first presentation leverages actually the interest of having an open design for path vector, stuff like that are not restricted to particular network topology and context and elements. And in the light of this, actually, we can try to play some scenarios to really test how open and flexible the path vector. I think path vector and properties are definitely two items that will open the way for heterogeneous technology, because now the trend is end-to-end path. End-to-end path means ANEs of any type. So anything needs to be said? No?
Okay.
In which case,
Thank you very much.
thank you very much to everybody. No. Oh, I don't feel. Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. That's so nice. Thank you. Okay. So maybe we should take a good picture with those beers.
No, take the one in the back of the room somewhere.